Today, we'll be discussing a mysterious and gruesome murder case that took place in Chicago, Illinois in 1977 of an immigrant woman from the Philippines that absolutely just baffled police. But be sure to stick around because this case was solved in one of the most unconventional and ridiculous ways possible, although it does have quite a rather tragic ending. Today, we will be discussing the murder case of Teresita Basso. Stay tuned. Hello everyone, I'm MrLex, and welcome to the channel. If you're a fan of anything paranormal, dark, and spooky told in the form of a story, then this is the channel for you. So please, if you find you enjoy this video, use your chin to tap the like button, tap subscribe with notifications on so you can get all of our future uploads, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the case, and maybe an idea of a story that we should cover in a future video, because we just might end up doing it. Now, with that out of the way, on to the story. Having been born in the Philippines in 1929, Teresita Basso would immigrate to the United States in the 1960s to study music. Later on, she would find that she actually also shared a passion for respiratory therapy, which resulted in her getting a job at the Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, Illinois as a respiratory therapist. While she was working at the Edgewater Hospital, she was also continuing to pursue a master's degree in music. She was also, in her free time, giving free piano lessons to the neighborhood kids around the block, which should give you an idea of just how hardworking, ambitious, and caring this woman really was. And when she wasn't doing all of that, she was spending a nice, quiet life with her boyfriend, Joe, and really, she was the last person on anybody's list that you would ever think would have become the victim of a violent crime. Just a quiet and unassuming woman that would just keep to herself and bother nobody. But that's something we know nobody is ever really truly safe from, now are they? This led though to complete shock on February 21st of 1977 when the fire department was called to put out a fire in her apartment. About an hour before this fire started, she was on the phone with Ruth Loeb, a friend of hers, and they were talking for about 30 minutes or so, and Teresita actually informed Loeb that she was going to have a friend come over, but she didn't clarify to her who this friend was or why they were even coming over in the first place. About an hour after Teresita's phone call with Loeb, firefighters would then be rushing into her apartment after getting several calls from the neighbors of a strong smell of smoke lingering in the area. What they found once they got into her apartment was absolutely horrifying. They found this woman's nude body tucked up underneath her mattress with a large butcher knife buried deep inside of her chest. Once the fire was out, the police were instantly called in to investigate, and what they determined was that this fire had only been set to cover up a murder. With her body being naked when they found her, they immediately took this as evidence of a sexual crime. However, when her autopsy report would come back, they would find that she had in fact not been raped, and she was simply stripped of her clothing for a reason that wasn't really immediately clear to the police. It was almost like the murderer only did it to serve as yet another distraction from whatever the true crime was that had taken place, and this would actually later on prove to be true. At the time, there was no real motive visible for this crime, and to make matters worse, there was very little physical evidence that had been left behind by the perpetrator because all of the possible evidence had pretty much been destroyed by the fire. The only thing that they managed to find that could even be slightly considered evidence was a memo that had been written down in Teresita's diary that read, "Get theater tickets for AS," and this really was not giving police a whole lot to go off of, but it was the only thing they had, so they rounded up a few shaky leads, and they were assuming that somebody with the initials AS was probably involved with this crime. The issue with this, though, is that they didn't know what the initials stood for, and it wasn't enough to simply charge somebody because they shared initials with a random memo in a notebook about buying theater tickets. Immediately, though, her boyfriend Joe was actually the lead suspect, and they had brought him in because they had had a recent argument, but ultimately this lead would go nowhere, and Joe was just let off because they couldn't find any connection between him and this crime. And after 6 months of questioning every suspect that they could and failing to get any solid leads or physical evidence to lead to a conviction, the investigators started to think that this case was just going to go cold and they were never going to solve it. But what happened next, though, would be a completely unexpected turn of events, because Joe Statula, the lead detective on the case, would get contacted with information by a very unlikely source, and it would actually end up proving vital in solving this investigation. A surgeon from the hospital that Teresita worked at named Joe Chua would actually end up getting in touch with Detective Joe Statula and inform him of a very strange recurring incident that was happening almost every other night now with his wife, Remy Chua. She was another respiratory therapist at the hospital, and before I explain why this is so strange, I need to let you know that She barely even knew Teresita. Like, they were pretty much complete strangers. They had only ever spoke maybe a couple times. They simply were co-workers, but it was such a big hospital that not everybody knew everybody. I mean, this hospital was one of the biggest ones in Chicago, Illinois. But Remy had begun to see visions, and these visions started while she was actually in the locker room at work, and this is where she first began to see what she claimed was a man's face behind the face of Teresita. Not knowing what any of this meant initially, she just chalked it up to nothing and tried to move on with her day and forget about it. That was until she saw the vision again, recurring now in her dreams, almost every night. And in these dreams, Teresita would actually begin to beg and plead with Remy to go to the police and tell them who her killer was, and she would name her killer to Remy in the dream. But Remy never acted on it. Then one night, Remy was taking a nap next to her husband and began talking in her sleep. This just stunned her husband because it was out of nowhere, and she was talking in a voice that clearly was not her own voice. And what happened next was just weird because she begins to plead with Remy's husband and say, "Doctor, I would like to ask for your help. The man who murdered me is still at large." And then Joe, asking back in a frightened tone who she was, just says, "Who are you? Why are you in my wife?" She responds and says, "I am Teresita Basa. You have nothing to be scared of. I am only here to ask for help." Then she goes on to explain to Joe that the name of her killer is Alan Showery, and that Showery was an orderly that also worked at the hospital with them, and she started to beg and plead with Joe to please go to the police and tell them what you just learned. But Joe decided that, yeah, this is freaky and ridiculous, and I probably would, but I don't have evidence, so I'm not going to waste my time going to the police to be told that this is a useless joke. So Joe just doesn't do anything with it until the same incident would happen a second time. And this second time, Remy was taking another nap, and Teresita had yet again begun to speak through Remy and change her voice, same whole thing again. But this time, instead of pleading with Joe like she did last time, she decides to go and kind of firmly tell Joe, "Why didn't you go to the police with the information about my killer?" And Joe's just like, "Well, I didn't have any evidence. What am I supposed to do? I don't have anything to give them. They're going to laugh at me and run me off." She explains that, "Look, Alan Showery actually stole some of my jewelry after he killed me, and he gave some of it to his girlfriend. And after this, he decides, okay, look, if I don't do something about this, this is probably going to keep happening to my wife, so I'm going to go ahead and explain this to the police and tell them what she's told me." So Joe Chua does. He finally gets in contact with the police with the information, and he informs them of it. He tells them, "Look, I know this is going to sound absolutely crazy, but my wife has apparently been channeling the spirit of Teresita Basa like every couple nights now, and she keeps telling me that the name of her killer is Alan Showery, and that he's an orderly at the hospital and stole some of Teresita's jewelry and apparently gave it to his girlfriend." And now Detective Joe Statula is just sitting there listening to this. He has no idea what to think. I mean, this guy just gave him information that he has no idea if it's trustworthy or not. And not that I could even blame him anyway, because this guy just called him up and said, "I've been, listening to my wife channel the spirit of a dead woman, and they just told me all the information to solve this case and laid it at my feet." But not having anything else to go off of, Detective Joe Statula decides, you know what, I have no other things I can use for this case. I'm going to go ahead and run a background check on Showery just in case. So what he does once he runs this background check is learns that Showery actually lives fairly close to Teresita. After learning this from the background check, Detective Statula immediately gets in touch with some of the co-workers who were friends with Teresita at the hospital, and he learns from them that Teresita had actually planned on having Showery come over that night to fix her television for her. And this is probably who Teresita was talking about in the conversation with Ruth Lowe when she mentioned that she was having a friend come over in about an hour. And this hour was, coincidentally, the hour right before she was murdered. And now, with this newfound information in hand, Detective Statula goes and decides to bring Showery down to the station for questioning. And when Showery gets to the station and he's being questioned, he denies having killed Teresita right off the bat, but he does say, "Yes, I did indeed go to Teresita's apartment that night to fix her television. However, I found out I didn't have the tools I needed to do it, so I left and went home and I didn't come back." Not believing this, Detective Statula decides to go off the jewelry clue now and get in touch with Showery's girlfriend and actually ask her, "Hey, did Showery give you any jewelry recently? And if so, would you be willing to let the friends and family of Teresita Basa examine it?" Showery's girlfriend actually very willingly does so. She says, sure, go right ahead, examine the jewelry, and they do. They give the jewelry to Teresita's friends and family, they look it over, and they decide and they say, yes, some of this did indeed belong to Teresita. So, with this newfound information in hand, Detective Statula brings Showery right back down to the station again for more questioning, and now, after confronting him with the jewelry evidence this time, he comes forth and Showery says, yes, I did it, and this is how. And with disbelief in his face, the detective is just stunned by the fact that any of this worked, and he's just listening to Showery now as he explains how he killed this woman and what happened. And what happened was that the first part about Showery coming to Teresita's apartment that night to fix her television, that was indeed true. And he did leave claiming that he didn't have the tools to fix her TV. But when he left, he immediately hatched a plan to rob Teresita. And he decides, look, I'm going to go back to this woman's apartment right now and I'm going to rob and murder her. So what he does is he goes, he knocks on her door, and Teresita answers it and immediately allows Showery right back inside. As she's turned around, locking the door, Showery grabs her from behind, flips her around, and brutally stabs her in the chest. And then he strips off all of her clothing, drags her to her bedroom, puts her mattress on top of her, grabs as much of her jewelry as he can carry, lights her on fire with the mattress, and then books it, and then acts like none of this ever happened, having done this to make it look like a sexual crime to throw police off from the fact that he actually just wanted to steal her jewelry. Unfortunately, even though he confessed to this story really does not have a happy ending, because when it came time for Showery to actually go to court, he would plead not guilty in the sense that all of the evidence against him came from the great beyond, and that none of this could be admissible. And it ends up being that the detectives argue with him and they say, look, when you came down to the station, you were tactic as though you were ready to be arrested. You seemed like you were guilty and you just already seemed like you were done, and this ends up in a mistrial. So instead of getting convicted, he goes to court yet again. And in this court hearing, he actually ends up pleading guilty this time. I'm not sure what changed his mind. I guess he decided that the evidence against him was actually pretty strong, because it was. His girlfriend had his, Teresita's jewelry that he stole. And this would result in him getting sentenced to 14 years, which is already a very light sentence in the first place for a murder trial. This guy killed a woman in cold blood and gets 14 years. But that's not where it stops, because this gets way worse. He was let out on parole in 1983, just 4 years after his conviction, and he goes to New York shortly after this, as if it never happened. This man got off with just 4 years for killing a woman in cold blood. If that's not a ridiculously unjustified light sentence, I don't know what is. This man deserved so much worse, and it's just a very sad and tragic ending to an already truly sad and mystifying tale. But yeah, as far as the possession thing goes though, with Remy Chua, it's been speculated that maybe she was just making it all up and it was a hoax, and that in reality she had learned the information from her friends, or maybe even Showery himself, and she was scared to go to police because she thought that if she told, that Showery was going to come to her house and try to kill her too. So instead of going to police, she supposedly might have faked the whole possession thing to tell her husband about what happened so he could go to police instead, and that, he wouldn't probably come after him because he's a man. At least that was the hope anyway. And apparently it worked, if that's true, but this is still all just speculation. There's no evidence of this, and there's definitely proof that she did not know Teresita at all, so take it for what you will. Honestly, I think the whole possession thing is probably possible, so I'm not gonna say either way you're right or wrong, whatever you believe. Regardless of whether it is true or not that she was possessed, it doesn't matter. What really matters with the story is that this woman's murderer got off with just 4 years in prison. That's ridiculous. He should have been rotting for life. Whatever. I don't control the justice system, but if I did, he would never have gotten out. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video, because if you did, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like, a comment with your thoughts on the story, and suggestions for future videos that we should potentially do. And also, please, don't forget to tap subscribe and the notification bell so that you can get all of our future uploads. And if you enjoyed this video, we have another video that should be popping up on screen right about now, and I think you guys will probably enjoy that one as well. With that, I'm MrLex, and I'll see you guys again next video.